Hey guys, it's Lainey, host of the True Crime Fan Club podcast. If you're a true crime addict like I am, then my podcast is for you. It's a podcast for the ultimate true crime enthusiast, giving you a glimpse into the life and crimes of the most demented minds. You won't want to miss an episode.
Hi, I'm Tawny Plattis, and you're listening to Dirty Bits, the podcast that explores the dirty bits of history your teacher probably left out. Hans Christian Andersen is the beloved author of fairy tales such as The Emperor's New Clothes, The Ugly Duckling, and Thumbelina. But the creator of The Little Mermaid was a big, neurotic, painfully self-aware, goofy-looking man-child who obsessively tossed off and kept a careful record in his diary each time he did. Hans Christian Andersen was born in Odense, Denmark, in 1805 to a cobbler and his wife, and he had one half-sister, courtesy of Mama Andersen boinking a married man 10 years her junior before he came along. They lived in the impoverished part of town with open sewers, an active red light district, and a shared house with 3 other families, which meant 12 people total were crammed together without any privacy. Hans Christian was this gangly, dorky-looking kid who didn't like to play with the other children because he wanted to make clothes for his dolls. He was basically the weird, awkward, artsy kid that nobody liked and the other kids were mean to him. He's the underdog you root for in any high school movie made after 1985. He was once described by a companion as strange and bizarre in his movements and carriage. His arms and legs were long and thin and out of all proportion. His hands were broad and flat, and his feet of gigantic dimensions. His nose was so disproportionately large that it seemed to dominate his whole face. And he totally knows he's a gawky nerd, once describing himself to his on-again, off-again buddy Charles Dickens as one who seemed to have fallen from the skies. So anyway, when he's a kid, his dad is super supportive and encouraging, even though he himself only received a basic education. He used to read to his son from Arabian Nights, and that's supposedly what inspired his love for fairy tales. By all accounts, Hans loved his dad, and they were super tight. But in 1812, this guy comes up to Papa Andersen, and he's like, "Hey, I'm supposed to go to war, but I'll pay you to do it for me, and I'll give you enough so you and your family are set for life." So he goes, "Oh, I'd be crazy not to, of course." And he accepts, and he's gone fighting in the war for 2 years. He gets back home, and the guy pays him the agreed-upon amount, but the state went bankrupt in 1813, so the sum's value isn't worth jack shit what it once was. And Papa Andersen is devastated, totally wrecked by the war. And then he gets sick and dies in 1816. So Hans Christian looks around and decides he needs to get the hell out of Odense, and he makes his way to Copenhagen when he's 14. He has a beautiful soprano voice, and he likes poetry, singing, dancing, and he performs for the wealthier people in the city while he's trying to find work as an actor. This guy named Jonas Collin, the director of the Royal Theatre, court official, senior civil servant, a well-known philanthropist, and all-around good guy, takes pity on him because he's so driven and hardworking, but he's also this starving, uneducated kid without a family. So he becomes Hans Christian's patron and sends him to boarding school to get a proper education, which ends up totally backfiring and just scarring him for life, no big deal. They put him in a class with a bunch of younger kids as a teenager, and they make fun of him because he's emotional and effeminate. They tell him he has a womanly sickness because the 19th century was sexist as hell. The headmaster is terribly cruel to Hans Christian. He tells him to stop writing, and he and other authority figures in the young man's life give him all these tips for suppressing his feminine, womanly sickness. He's verbally abused for years in the name of helping him become a man. But instead, the school ends up giving him lifelong emotional damage because that's what happens when you're mean to your kids. After he finishes school, he's determined to become a writer and starts traveling through Europe via the kindness of the patronizing nobles he's schmoozed with. He starts turning out travel books, dramas, autobiographies, poetry, and is really just trying to get famous. He has some poems and stories published, and several works staged at the Royal Theatre. His first novel, set in Italy, sells well in Scandinavia and Germany, and is followed in 1834 by his first book of fairy tales for children. The fairy tales are wildly successful, and in his Lady Gaga-like quest for fame, his already inflated ego grew 3 sizes that day. He has this uncanny knack for making friends in high places. He's rubbing elbows with European monarchs, crown princes, dukes, counts, and lords. He stays with them in their homes, signs copies of his work, and entertains their children, even though he ironically doesn't really like kids. But still, everybody kept waiting for him to eventually settle down and get married, but it never happened. Though in his life, he made many acquaintances, he had almost no romantic success. He likely died a virgin, even though his diaries revealed intense erotic feelings for both men and women. He seemed to be fascinated by sex, but was either unable or uninterested in actually having it. Often his letters and diaries suggest he experienced the unrequited love he wrote about in his fairy tales, like The Little Mermaid. After his first rejected marriage proposal, he wrote, "I shall never be engaged, and it would be a great misfortune if it were to ever take place." When he was 25, he fell in love with 2 siblings, Christian and Ryborg Voigt, the children of a wealthy merchant. Ryborg was already secretly engaged to a man her parents weren't down with, and that may have actually been what piqued Hans Christian's interest. When Ryborg turned him down, he told his friends she wasn't that cute anyway and he didn't care. But later, he wrote a more romantic version of the story. Sounding like a jilted teenager, he said, "Last summer, I met a rich, lovely, spirited girl who feels the same for me as I do for her. Certain circumstances made her marry a man who took her fortune." Then there was Jenny Lind, the opera singer. One of his stories, The Nightingale, was written about her, and that became the inspiration for her nickname, the Swedish Nightingale. Andersen even went so far as to shyly propose to Jenny. When she was getting on a train to go to an opera concert, Andersen gave her a letter of proposal. She wrote him back in 1844, expressing what nobody wants to hear when they have a crush on their friend. "Farewell. God bless and protect my brother is the sincere wish of his affectionate sister, Jenny." Oh, poor guy. He also felt strongly for the son of his patron who put him through school, Edvard Collin, writing to him, "I languish for you, as for a pretty Calabrian wench. My sentiments for you are those of a woman. The femininity of my nature and our friendship must remain a mystery." Collin, who ended up marrying a person of the lady variety himself, wrote in his own memoir, "I found myself unable to respond to this love, and this caused the author much suffering." But even when his feelings were reciprocated, Hans Christian seemed to run away. He would always say he didn't have enough money to get married. Then as his fortune increased, he would suddenly raise the bar on the required income for matrimony. After leading on the daughter of H.C. Orsted, he wrote to her, "Beloved Sophie, you will never know how happy I would have been with you. If only I had the money." Andersen also experienced an epic infatuation with the Grand Duke Karl Alexander of Weimar. He wrote, "I quite love the young Duke. He is the first of all princes that I really find attractive. The hereditary Grand Duke walked arm in arm with me across the courtyard of the castle to my room, kissed me lovingly, asked me always to love him, though he was just an ordinary person, asked me to stay with him this winter. I fell asleep with the melancholy, happy feeling that I was the guest of this strange prince at his castle and loved by him. It is like a fairy tale." And then there was Harold Scharf, a dancer with the Royal Ballet and 30 years younger than Hans Christian. He wrote of Harold, "I long for him daily." So he would spend all day lusting after these men and women he was often friends with, but he would never do anything about it. If he had a visitor he found attractive, he would run up to his room and furiously masturbate. He would record it with incredible detail in his diary, saying about one particular dirty bit of his day, "Today I had a visit from such and such person. They're so sweet. When they left, I had a double sensuous." And he would put these little crosses next to entries on days where he jacked off, And he had a coded system so he knew if it was a particularly satisfying wank. In one entry, he described seeing an especially attractive nun we can assume he later fantasized about. Hansi Christian Andersen would also frequently visit European brothels and talk to the prostitutes, then return to his hotel room to describe the encounters and enjoy another solo sesh. His descriptions in his diary were cryptic. He describes being flustered, and he was nervous he caught something, possibly indicating some kind of sexual experience. But then again, he was also an admitted hypochondriac, so his lifelong virginity still seems entirely plausible. It's also easy to see how he could have put a lot of people off, which could explain his unmarried status. He was a major kiss ass, and turned a few stomachs with his sickeningly sweet flattery. The English novelist Mary Russell Mitford said she was completely disgusted by Andersen's social climbing. He uses fame merely as a key to open drawing room doors, a ladder to climb into high places, she snorted. And she wasn't the only one. Another friend once lost all his damn patience and wrote him the following letter. When I raise my voice, that indicates the writer chose to use all capital letters in what was an early version of screaming in all caps via instant messenger. You certainly do your best to wear out your friends, and all because of the ceaseless concern with yourself, your own ego, the great poet you think you will be. Even when he was in his 60s, he was described as a child, entirely egotistical, innocently vain, the center of life, interest, concern, and meaning to himself. And after Hans Christian died, the Danish critic George Brands wrote that Andersen's mind was wholly filled by himself. One story in particular demonstrates the extent of his obliviousness. Hans Christian once had the honor of meeting Charles Dickens and totally fanboyed all over him, calling him the greatest writer of our time. Dickens was endeared, of course, and invited him to stay with him over the summer, which turned out to be a huge mistake. He was a terrible house guest, and what was supposed to be a short little visit turned into a 5-week ordeal for Charles Dickens. After he finally left, Dickens pinned a note to the room Hans Christian had stayed in that said, Hans Andersen slept in this room for 5 weeks, which seemed to the family ages. He was also said to have once thrown himself face down on Charles Dickens' lawn after reading a negative review and cried his heart out. After that, Dickens and his family were really weirded out and stopped responding to Hans Christian Andersen's letters, effectively ghosting him. And Hans Christian could not fathom why. But you almost can't be mad at him, because he also knows who he is. He's an admitted drama queen and attention whore. Once writing to a friend when he was 19, my nasty vanity sneaks in. There is a kind of unpleasant dreaminess in me, something restless and impulsive in my soul. And once he started achieving his much-desired fame, he wrote, my name is gradually starting to shine, and there is only one thing I live for. I covet honor in the same way as a miser covets gold. And he became incredibly famous and wealthy. As far as his work goes, most European critics loved him, except in his native Denmark. And the feeling was mutual. He's ashamed of his less than glamorous family, that included an uncle who was a patient in an insane asylum, a mother who was an uneducated washerwoman and daughter of a prostitute, a half-sister who was a prostitute, and an aunt who owned a brothel. In Denmark, critics didn't care for his work, and they knew about his shady background and he never felt appreciated, and started talking mad shit about his native country. When he's staying in Paris, he writes to a friend saying, here in this big strange city, Europe's most famous and noble personalities fondly surround me. And at home, boy sits spitting at my heart's dearest creation. The Danes are evil, cold, satanic, a people well suited to the wet, moldy green island. My home has sent me a fever from its cold, wet forests, which the Danes gaze upon and believe they love. But I don't believe in love in the north, but in evil treachery. No nation has more prejudice, I think, than the Danes. To deride and sneer, to watch for the weak points in our neighbors, that is our evil nature. I wish my eyes may never again see the home which can only see my shortcomings, The Danes can be evil, cold, satanic, a people well suited to those damp, moldy green islands. So bitter. As Hans Christian became more and more well known, he got the travel bug and for some reason enjoyed countries where he was already famous. He was on the road constantly, even though he was a hypochondriac and suffered from horrific anxiety. The poor guy was a hot mess when he traveled. He carried a 9-meter rope for fear of finding himself trapped by fire. He would get seasick. He was paranoid about being robbed, and he thought one of his fellow travelers might be crazy and was planning to murder him. In general, he was afraid of dogs, wouldn't eat pork because he was scared to catch trichini, and he would position a note beside his bed every time he slept, which read, "I only appear to be sleeping," in case anyone thought he was dead and buried him alive. And again, he's so self-aware, you can't help but feel compassion for him. He knew how irrational he was, and once wrote in his diary, "Oh, how good I am at finding things to worry about." But despite all of his peccadillos and tribulations, Hans Christian still considered his life to be like the fairy tales he wrote, saying that, "My life is a lovely story, happy and full of incident." And nobody can debate that Hansi Christian Andersen most certainly had a life filled with incidents. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions or corrections for me, let me know in the comments section. Have a dirty day.